So our next speaker is Professor John Abraham, who is a professor of sociology in the Department of Social Science, Health and Medicine at King's College in London. He researches on the politics of pharmaceutical development and regulation, particularly in Europe and North America, and that development that's taken place over the last century or so. He's written widely on this subject, and he's also written 6 books, the last of which was Unhealthy Pharmaceutical Regulation, which was published in 2013. And he's also been a special expert advisor to the UK Parliament's House of Commons committee during their 8-month investigation into the influence of the pharmaceutical industry, which took place in 2004 and 2005. So without further ado, over to Professor Abraham.
Okay. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here to talk to you today about the misadventures of pharmaceutical regulation. Just to add to that introduction slightly, I'll say that I'm a social scientist. I'm not a clinician or a psychiatrist. What I do mostly is look at the adequacy of our social and political systems to work in the best interests of public health in relation to the scientific knowledge, the best scientific knowledge that is available or could, in principle, be available. Some nice pictures. So I want to start with a little bit of history. For most of the history of the pharmaceutical industry and pharmaceuticals in our society, in fact, the situation has been that pharmaceutical manufacturers and their scientists simply decided that it looked like a particular pharmaceutical was safe and might work in some way and would be put in the market. And citizens or consumers just took their chance on the market. They would go into an apothecary shop or a pharmacist and buy it and see what happened. And doctors might prescribe it for them on the same basis, but there was no government regulation of what the manufacturers were doing or of the claims made by their scientists. And incredibly, in this country, that situation persisted beyond the creation of the National Health Service in 1948. We didn't get modern pharmaceutical regulation in this country until the early 70s. So for 20 plus years of the NHS was paying for drugs for which there was absolutely no systematic or independent testing of their safety or efficacy. So in 1937 in the United States, we had this thing called the elixir sulfanilamide disaster. This was an antibacterial drug which was used for minor ailments such as a sore throat, but it killed 107 Americans in 1937, and most of them died after being prescribed the drug by their doctors. So as a consequence of this and other factors that I don't have time to go into, the United States created the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, which meant that drug companies had to get their drugs approved by the government drug regulatory agency known as the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA for short. So the FDA then had to approve the evidence that the company had assembled as to whether or not the drug was safe. Nothing happened here at that time, despite the obvious implications, you would think. But then in the 1960s, a sedative, which some of you may have heard of, known as thalidomide, was given to calm down, let's say, or reduce the anxiety of pregnant mothers. And unfortunately, this drug was actually what we call teratogenic. That means it was toxic to the fetus. So they gave birth to many deformed, malformed babies, and some babies also died. As a consequence of this, we got a raft of regulatory changes. Government drug regulation of safety and efficacy of new drugs was introduced in the UK. The US also did this. It also strengthened its regulation to extend to whether or not drugs were effective or efficacious. And similarly, in other European countries such as Germany, we got regulations of drug safety and efficacy. It has to be said that these already existed in the Nordic countries as far back as the late 1920s and early 1930s. So there was the scientific capability to have proper drug regulation way back as early as that, but we won't get into more details about that history. I might just add that in the United States, some patients have been given thalidomide on clinical trials. So even though the FDA never allowed the drug onto the market in the US, there were American thalidomide victims. And therefore, there was also a response from the United States. So basically, by the late 1960s, early 1970s, there was a kind of assumption or an agreement, a consensus, that it was an indefensible situation that pharmaceutical companies who had an interest in selling their drugs and making a profit from that, they should be the people who decided whether drugs should go on the market. So there was a recognition of conflict of interest. That didn't really exist. There wasn't really a consensus that there was such a thing as conflict of interest in that way. And this is a quote from the Pharmaceutical Journal, which is a journal that is friendly to the pharmaceutical industry and pharmaceutical sector. It's not exactly a critic. But even here it's saying, it's not really on for pharmaceutical companies to be deciding whether their drugs should go on the market or not. Somebody else has got to make that decision. And government regulation was to be the decision-making body. And I'll just say briefly that in the United States, after drug efficacy regulation was introduced in 1962, the FDA did a review of all the drugs that had been allowed onto the market up until that point in 1966. And this gives you an indication of just how bad the industry science was in terms of testing for the efficacy of the drugs. So the FDA reviewed 4,000 medical drugs on the market, included only half were effective, and 600 were so poor in their evidence of efficacy they had to be immediately banned. Now, so we got modern drug regulation by the early 1970s in most of Europe and North America, and some other countries. But research in the social and political sciences, including some of my own work, has then subsequently showed that even after drug regulation had been introduced, in the 1970s and the 1980s, serious commercial bias in pharmaceutical drug testing continued, and worse, regulatory bias, commercial bias in regulatory decision also existed. So there was commercial bias within the regulatory decision-making process by the government itself. And this pervaded all aspects of drug testing. Non-clinical toxicology testing, clinical trials, which we've heard a bit about earlier today, and then also what's so-called post-market pharmacoepidemiology. This is the collecting of data about what happens to drugs once they're on the market, patients reporting adverse drug reactions, and so on. So across all these types of data systems, we saw commercial bias in the industry's application and use of them, and also we saw commercial bias in regulatory decision-making. And this was demonstrated in my book, Science, Politics, and the Pharmaceutical Industry, and also confirmed in the psychotropic field in the Therapeutic Nightmare in 1999. I mention these because this is a long time ago that social and political science has established this. So I just want to say a little bit about what were the conclusions then that we reached what sort of conclusions had we reached by the mid or late 90s about bias in industry drug testing in the 1970s and 1980s. Well, we discovered that industry scientists made claims that were in contradiction with the scientific standards in the field that they were working. They're making contradictory recommendations about drug use according to what would be tolerated in the particular country. So if one regulator didn't allow them to claim one thing, they might not claim that. But if another regulator allowed them to claim the exact opposite, they'd do it. It would emphasize drug efficacy beyond the scientific evidence and/or downplay evidence of drug toxicity. They would be involved in testing commercially promising Me Too drugs. These are minor molecular modifications of existing drugs already in the market, even though these drugs are of little or no therapeutic advance. So in 1979, way back in 1979, the FDA concluded that only 39 of 1,816 pending new drugs under investigation, undergoing clinical trials and so on, only 39 of those promised important therapeutic aims. That's about 2%. Industry scientists expend considerable effort to demonstrate efficacy, but only embark on demanding toxicity tests when required to do so by regulators. Also, pharmaceutical firms would frequently exert editorial control over so-called scientific publications about their drugs. They would strengthen the certainty of clinicians' favorite claims about their drugs, but they would emphasize uncertainty and the tentative nature of negative claims about their drugs. Clinicians making unfavorable claims about a firm's drug might find their publication of their manuscript would be delayed, while company scientists were given time to come up with responding papers diluting or undermining its claims, while those making favorite claims would suffer no such fate. If a clinician actually publishes a high-profile scientific paper threatening the viability of a new drug, then the manufacturer may fund and organize a consensus conference of experts to contradict the clinical clinician, irrespective of the validity of the competing claims. And when animal models show that a new drug is carcinogenic to rodents, this means that it induces cancer in the animals, the manufacturer typically argues against the extrapolation of the tumor findings in the animals to human populations. But when animal carcinogenicity studies show new drugs are absolutely free from carcinogenicity in the rodents, the drug companies conclude that this demonstrates that the drug poses no carcinogenic risk to patients. If post-marketing adverse drug reactions that are reported by practicing doctors and physicians suggest that the new drug is unsafe, companies frequently argue that such data is invalid, unreliable, anecdotal, compared with randomized controlled clinical trial data on which the drug was approved as safe. But if subsequent to marketing, it is found that the randomized controlled trial data implies the drug is unsafe, the manufacturer often argues that it has been used in clinical practice without any adverse drug reaction alarms, and the post-market experience indicates that the drug is safe. So in other words, if the post-marketing adverse drug reaction says that the drug is unsafe, then they fall back on the randomized controlled trials as the gold standard. If something is found to be wrong with the randomized control trials, then they say, oh, look, doctors have been using it for years, there have been no problems. That's the evidence we should trust, not the randomized control trial data. If it's discovered that a randomized control trial, once used by the manufacturer to support approval of a drug as safe, actually contains data implying the drug is dangerous, rather than having a change of mind to conclude that the drug is unsafe, the manufacturers frequently disown their own randomized controlled trials, claiming that the trial's design was invalid. So all of these things, I call this commercial bias in drug testing because the claims that are being made are contradictory or inconsistent with the scientific evidence, and they are also consistently correlated with the commercial interests of the company. So the way to explain them is commercial bias. Now, some people might say, well, that's what you'd expect, drug companies, right, to make a profit. We're not very surprised about that. Okay, I mean, cynics do say that, though I would say, these people are still supposed to be scientists, even if they're working for industry. But let's accept that. Let's be cynical and say, well, we'd expect that anyway. But what about commercial bias in drug regulation? What about the government regulators being commercially biased? They're supposed to be the ones that are charged with protecting public health in the interests of public health, and certainly not in the commercial interests of companies. So there are two types of commercial bias I want to draw attention to here. One is what I call organizational, and the other is about decision-making and regulatory outcomes. So what sort of regulatory system was established in the UK in the early 70s and through the 70s and the 1980s? Well, first of all, the process was entirely secret. So unauthorized sharing of information about the regulatory process by regulators or their advisors was a criminal offense under the 1911 Official Secrets Act and strengthened by the secrecy clauses of the 1968 Medicines Act. So the UK drug regulatory system was to be light touch regulation shielded from public scrutiny. By 1989, despite all the secrecy, the government did eventually release information about what sort of commercial interests expert advisors to the UK regulatory system had. Up until then, it had been completely secret. We didn't even know that most of our expert advisors to the UK Government Regulatory Authority. Up until this point, we didn't even know that most of them had shares and other sorts of consultancies and paid work and all the rest of it. We didn't know that they had all these conflicts of interest in the pharmaceutical companies that they were regulating. We didn't even know that. But as you can see from the column neither, only around about a quarter of the UK people who were expert advisors advising the UK Drug Regulatory Authority on whether or not new drugs should be put on the market, only about a quarter of them didn't have various sorts of interests in pharmaceutical companies. And then we also have this more subtle process of what we social scientists call regulatory capture. So between 1971 and 1989, the UK Drug Regulatory Authority was called the Medicines Division. It was part of the Department of Health. It was funded 50%, approximately 50% through fees from pharmaceutical companies. But in addition to that, a lot of the people who worked for the Drug Regulatory Authority subsequently went on to work for pharmaceutical companies. In fact, a lot of them came from pharmaceutical companies in the first place, then went to the regulatory authorities, then went back to the pharmaceutical industry, promoted at a higher level. And I think my favorite story about this is that one week in 1984, the head of the UK Drug Regulatory Agency, the Medicines Division, he went to work in the Department of Health's Medicine Division on Tuesday, and on Wednesday, he went to work as the head of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. And when he was asked to justify this is what he said. He said, all my deputies at the Medicines Division, principal medical officers, had been in industry. All the superintendent pharmacists that I had working for me came from industry. It is equally clear that within the last 12 months, I am not the only member of medical staff of the division to move back into the industry, and so on. So the bias that we get in the regulatory decision-making, so that was the organizational bias. We also get bias in regulatory decision-making in the 70s and 1980s. Fundamentally, what we found in our research is that regulators award the benefit of the scientific doubt to industry interests rather than the interests of public health. The regulators emphasize scientific uncertainty to justify regulatory inaction, such as whether or not to make labeling changes or to withdraw the drug from the market. So justify regulatory inaction against a drug, even if it's offering no therapeutic advance on existing treatments. This is quite routine. They will make permissive approval decisions inconsistent with the regulatory policy standards of the regulatory agency itself. They will make permissive approval decisions, including maintaining a drug on the market, inconsistent with the scientific assessment of the regulatory agency's own scientists. So if some of the scientists in the regulatory agency are saying this drug should be withdrawn, that doesn't mean the agency will decide to do that. So having said all this, though, in the 70s and 80s, it's not like all the regulatory agencies were the same. And it's very important that we learn from international comparisons. So, yes, there were these problems with the US Drug Regulatory Agency and the UK Drug Regulatory Agency, but they weren't all the same. And if you just focus on the first column of this table, the 1971 to 1992 bit, you see this is how many drugs had to be withdrawn from the market in each country on the grounds of safety. In other words, these are the drugs that the regulators had approved as safe enough to go onto the market and then had to be subsequently withdrawn. Again, you can see that in the United States it was 0.4 per year, and in the UK it was 1 per year. So one drug was so unsafe, had to be withdrawn from the market, having been approved. So 2.5 times more drug safety withdrawals in the UK than the US. Now, there are lots of ways of trying to explain this, and I have to cut a long story short here because of time, but basically, the main reason why the FDA had to withdraw fewer unsafe drugs from the market in the US rather than the UK was because it didn't approve so many unsafe drugs onto the market in the first place. And so there's a difference here. Both regulatory agencies were biased and permissive, but the UK was much more permissive than the US, 2.5 times permissive by this indicator, though you could have other indicators. Now, the industry argued that this safety protection advantage that the FDA delivered to its citizens was at the expense of people in the US getting access to new drugs that were beneficial to patients, right? The FDA was taking longer, it was argued, to get to review drugs, and therefore people in the US were deprived of drugs that British citizens were getting access to. So there's a guy called Schweitzer who looked at this. He looked at 34 pharmaceuticals marketed in the UK and the US from 1970 to 1988, designated as particularly therapeutically significant for patients by an international panel of doctors and pharmacists. And he found that the FDA approved more of these drugs before the UK regulators. So what this tells you was that the FDA's less permissive regulation delivered greater safety protection for its citizens than in the UK, and more therapeutically valuable drugs. So when we see this difference in outcomes, it begs the question, well, what's going on here? Why was the FDA better at delivering better outcomes than the UK? And here's some suggestions from the research I did. So the FDA is 100% funded by the state, not in this period, not partly funded by industry. FDA scientists came from more diverse backgrounds, not mostly from industry, but from other institutions as well. In the 1970s, Congress passed legislation making it illegal for FDA regulators to move straight back into industry. There were barriers to what we call regulatory capture. There was much more freedom of information in the US because the US had the Freedom of Information Act, whereas we had the Official Secrets Act. The US had much stronger public health advocacy organizations, so its citizenry were more active in these areas. And the US legal system made it easier to sue drug companies for drug injury. So all of these factors meant that the FDA had more confidence to impose tougher standards in the pharmaceutical industry, and they meant it would be held to public account for its standards more effectively. But that doesn't mean it was perfect. So the FDA did fail to meet some of its own standards. The FDA also maintained the sleeping pill triazolam, benzodiazepine drug, on the market at low doses. The high dose was withdrawn, but once they withdrew the high dose, there was absolutely no evidence that it was any longer efficacious. There was no evidence for its effectiveness at the low dose, but they allowed it to remain on the market. And 90% of the FDA's expert advisory committee that advised them to make that decision had conflicts of interest with the manufacturer. Perhaps I should have said at the beginning, as you probably gathered from now, I don't work specifically on psychiatric drugs. I work on all types of drugs, all types of pharmaceuticals, which includes psychopharmaceuticals. And you might also be wondering, why am I focusing so much on drug regulation? And I kind of alluded to this, I think, when I was talking about the cynical view. So you might you might recognize that there are, and I do recognize there are lots of problems with pharmaceutical companies. There are lots of problems with the psychiatry profession. There are lots of problems with patient organizations. There are lots of problems with a whole range of actors. But the role of government is absolutely crucial, because it is the government that permits any of these pharmaceuticals to be on our market. No matter how dreadful a pharmaceutical company is, it cannot get its drug onto the market unless the regulators allow it to put it on the market. Now, of course, we can talk about how the regulators are influenced and captured and all the rest of it, but ultimately, the government is crucial. The government can, in principle, stop all of this. So this is why it's important to focus on the regulatory system. So here, I'm just going to talk very briefly about an antidepressant. This is before the SSRI era, late 70s and 1980s. This is about a drug that probably none of you have ever heard of, called NormaFencin. And the reason it's not a big public profile drug like Prozac. And in a sense, that's the point, because this is a routine issue. This is a routine regulatory process. So this is before the serotonin hypothesis. The manufacturers are claiming that the drug's mechanism is via a multi-amine mechanism of dopamine and noradrenaline. And at this time, the view amongst the experts and regulators was that because of the high placebo response in antidepressant trials, regulatory standards in both the UK and the US stipulated that trials couldn't be too small because you needed large trials to demonstrate some efficacy. And this is a view that's still around. And you certainly shouldn't have less than 25 patients per group, and more likely you should have hundreds in your clinical trials. Now, at NormaFencin's UK launch, there were 12 non-placebo trials. None of these showed any efficacy over the comparator drug, none at all. There were 3 placebo trials showing some efficacy, but only one had more than 25 patients per group, and it was only 35 patients per group. Now, in isolation, you might think, well, these small trials that showed small placebo trials that showed efficacy, you might think, well, that means it must be enormously effective because it's much more difficult to show efficacy in small trials than large trials. But given the context of all the other trials, so NormaFencin could not be shown to be more efficacious than any existing antidepressants in even one of 20 such trials. Given that, it's highly implausible that actually it was enormously effective. It's much more plausible that the placebo trials were unreliable. And indeed, it was also the case that the regulators and the company even accepted that NormaFencin had no safety advantages over other antidepressants. In fact, it turned out to be extremely dangerous and had to be withdrawn from the market after many fatalities. Though, to be fair, that wasn't known at the time of approval. So, despite not meeting the regulators' own standards, though, of having larger trials, the UK regulators approved the drug within 10 months. By contrast, it took the FDA 6 years to approve this drug. Their review revealed that of the total 11 placebo protocols, 1 showed the placebo was more effective, 7 couldn't distinguish between placebo and the drug, and in just 3 protocols, NormaFencin showed superiority to placebo. Moreover, in those 3 protocols, there were less than 20 patients per group. But the idea that NormaFencin, again, was enormously effective was rendered incredible by the fact that it failed to outperform placebo in 85% of studies. So, again, the evidence is suggesting these trials showing efficacy over placebo, these few trials that showed that, weren't reliable. So FDA scientists refused to approve, concluding it was ineffective. Now, remember, the UK has already said this drug can be on the market. The FDA is saying it's not effective. The manufacturers then resubmitted an application. They pooled the small studies into a bigger study, arguing that this showed now that the drug was effective, called for a hearing with the FDA's Expert Advisory Committee on Antidepressants. The committee, and I haven't looked into the conflicts of interest in this committee, or at least I don't have them with me today, but that committee recommended approval, but FDA rejected its advice, saying that the pooling didn't show efficacy. In 1983, the company managed to get another hearing before the advisory committee, even though it hadn't done any further clinical studies. Again, the majority of experts voted to approve the drug onto the US market. And despite internal FDA communications showing that very senior scientists at the agency believed that the drug was either ineffective or at best had, quote, only modest evidence of effectiveness, this time the drug was approved onto the US market by the FDA. And once approved, discussions for labeling of the drug for doctors and psychiatrists stated that, quote, trials provide unequivocal evidence of antidepressant efficacy. So I know that's quite a lot of detail, and in some ways it's a bit laborious, but it gives you just a tiny flavor of what's happening inside these systems. How do these drugs get onto the market, right? And it nicely illustrates the routine, what I call permissive principle of pharmaceutical regulation and the associated biases at work, even in the 1970s and 1980s. But, importantly, it also shows the difference that then existed between the UK and the US. And the real reason why the US was taking longer, the real reason why the US FDA was taking longer to approve drugs than its British counterparts was because the evidence it was dealing with from companies to get these drugs on the market was really poor. They were grappling with really poor evidence of efficacy and sometimes safety as well. And they were dealing with a whole range of pressures. Now, that's not to excuse the fact that they approved this drug onto the market. It's just to say that's why it was taking longer for the FDA to approve drugs, not because they were denying patients therapeutic breakthroughs, of which only about 2% of the new drugs being produced by the industry met that criteria anyway. And as a parting shot on NormaFencin, I'll just say that this apparently unequivocally efficacious drug was eventually taken by an estimated 13 million patients worldwide as an antidepressant, about 500,000 of whom were in the UK. So, broad conclusion and lessons then from the period 1971 to 92 regarding the maximization of public health protective regulation. The light touch, rapid approval model of the UK was less effective in promoting and protecting public health than the FDA. What do we conclude from that then? What's the obvious conclusion from that? The obvious conclusion is regulation should move towards the less permissive model of the FDA in that period, with financial independence from the industry, barriers to capture, greater public accountability. However, as we've seen, even the FDA was too permissive. Even the FDA was too permissive, so future regulatory trajectory should aim to meet an even higher public health protective standard than the FDA. So some specific policy proposals. Again, this is social science being, social science proposals from 1995. Regulatory agencies should organize key clinical trials, maybe one per drug. They should also organize animal carcinogenicity testing, charge the cost to the company so the taxpayer doesn't pay for it. Regulatory states should develop more autonomous expertise in all of these drug testing sciences. There should be freedom of information, and we should have that freedom of information during the regulatory decision-making process, just after patents have been granted to the company. Regulators should be required to take account of comparative efficacy and medical need as factors in deciding whether a pharmaceutical should be permitted on the market or not just whether it's better than placebo. Such a criteria existed in Norway in the 1970s and 1980s, actually, and if you want to know more about that, have a look at my book on regulating medicines in Europe. We should ban conflicts of interest within regulatory decision-making. We should create legislative barriers to regulatory capture. And even as early as 1995, I concluded that regulatory bias was getting worse during the 1980s compared with the 1970s. And so that brings me to what I call the neoliberal era. So this is a period roughly from the late 80s to the 1990s. So neoliberal theory argued that our regulatory systems needed to be changed, but they didn't need to be changed in the ways that I proposed based on those social science findings. But they argued that regulation should be even lighter. It should limit business activity. It should have a lighter touch regulation that even existed previously in order to stimulate innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. This was the claim. And it was claimed that this would be good for patients, it would be good for citizens, because then they would get faster access to new drug innovations. And the pharmaceutical industry had been demanding this sort of thing for ages. It had been saying, we need to accelerate the amount of time that it takes for regulatory agencies to review our products. There's too much regulation, it's stifling innovation. And these innovative pharmaceuticals need to be accelerated onto the market because they're really important to patients. All of this was being said by the industry as well. And then we get a whole raft of neoliberal reforms. In the Thatcher and Major years, we get a situation in which the UK Drug Regulatory Agency becomes entirely funded by fees from pharmaceutical companies. We get the time periods of regulatory review cut by a half, then cut by a half again. And we get regulators within the regulatory agency being instructed to advance their consultation processes with pharmaceutical companies. In Germany, the same happens just a few years later. In Sweden, the same again happens a few years later. And not surprisingly, therefore, with Germany going down this route, the UK going down this route, Sweden going down this route, the supranational European Medicines Agency, which was created in 1995, also goes down this route. It is to be funded by fees from pharmaceutical companies, it is to advance consultation with companies, and it is to accelerate and shorten the time that regulators spend reviewing whether or not drugs are safe enough and effective enough to go on the market. And again, if you want to read more about this, have a look at regulating medicines in Europe. And in the United States, a similar thing happens. Remember George Bush Sr.? He and his and subsequent Vice President Quayle introduced the Prescription Drug Users Fee Act in 1992. This meant that in exchange for getting more resources, the FDA would become partly funded through fees from pharmaceutical companies. It would get that funding, which would be reviewed every 5 years by the pharmaceutical industry and Congress to see if the FDA was meeting its targets to accelerate the time it spent regulating drugs. So there was a clear quid pro quo here. The FDA would get more funding, but only in exchange for accelerating the regulatory process. Drugs were to be reviewed in half the length of time and then half again, and this was absolutely independent of whether the drugs offered any therapeutic advance or not. All drugs, even if they offered no therapeutic advance, they were to be reviewed much more rapidly and have much better chance of getting on the market. This is a graph that shows the increased dependence of the European Medicines Agency and the US FDA on industry fees as a percentage of the total income. You can see the graph is upward. Our regulatory agencies are becoming increasingly dependent on fees from pharmaceutical companies. In addition to that, the Bush Senior administration introduced this thing called accelerated review, which is different from shortening the period of time that the regulators are allowed to spend reviewing a new drug, but it's about reducing the amount of evidence that the company has to provide to demonstrate that the drug is effective. And the way in which this happened was to introduce what's called surrogate markers of efficacy. So, for example, in the area of cancer, if you're going to get a cancer drug, what do you want to know? You want to know, is the cancer drug going to improve people's symptoms, and or is it going to improve their survival? But some scientists, including the industry, argue that tumor shrinkage is a surrogate marker for that. But that's not an established surrogate marker. What accelerated approval did was to say that drugs can get on the market if they show efficacy based on the surrogate marker rather than the real clinical efficacy of survival or symptom improvement. And if they got on the market in that way, then they would have to demonstrate after the drug was on the market that there was real clinical efficacy through what are called post-market confirmatory studies. So the surrogate marker was to be confirmed after the drug was on the market. The FDA started doing this in 1992, and then subsequently it was also adopted here in the European Union in 2006. It was called Conditional Marketing Regulation. So we got all this raft of neoliberal reforms, and remember, the ideology that was justifying all these accelerated regulatory reforms under the neoliberal regimes was that we'd get more innovative pharmaceuticals onto the market. It was to improve pharmaceutical innovation. Okay, from 1998, so these neoliberal reforms were introduced in the sort of early 90s and beyond. Pharmaceutical innovation actually fell subsequently. We can see here the blue line, called total new molecular entities, represents all the types of pharmaceutical innovations. That's declining. But more importantly, the yellow line represents all the new molecular entities. That's declining. The blue line, which is the most important one, represents those pharmaceutical industries thought to provide some therapeutic advance, and that's also declining. So pharmaceutical innovations and drugs that are most valuable to patients, all of this is declining as a consequence of neoliberal reforms, even though the ideology was that these things were supposed to improve. As for the post-marketing confirmatory studies, let's just look at what happened with cancer drugs. So since 1992, when accelerated approval was introduced, many cancer drugs have been approved on the basis of these non-established surrogate efficacy measures, as I said, such as tumor shrinkage. Yet in the mid-2000s, post-marketing confirmatory studies had only been conducted for 25% of cancer drugs granted accelerated approval, As of November 2008, 65% of post-marketing confirmatory studies requested by the FDA were never completed, were for cancer drugs, and 60% of such post-marketing confirmatory studies that were completed for cancer drugs took over 5 years or more after they were approved onto the market. As of September 2009, that's 17 years after the regulation was introduced, FDA had never withdrawn a drug granted accelerated approval, even if the company had never done the confirmatory study. And despite these evident problems with accelerated approval, as I said, in 2006, the EU introduced an identical policy called conditional marketing approval. So learned absolutely nothing. And this isn't just confined to cancer drugs. I mean, for this audience, we could be talking about brain imaging techniques as a surrogate marker of the efficacy of psychotropic drugs, or indeed genetic biomarkers that are also being explored. So this surrogate efficacy markers could be applied to the psychotropic area as well. I'll just quickly also then talk about what happened to drug safety withdrawals in the neoliberal period. So if we now compare the 1971 to 1992 period with the 1993 to 2004 period, you see that in both the US and the UK, the number of drug safety withdrawals has gone up. So in the neoliberal period, we've got less from the previous graph I showed you, we've got less drugs that offer therapeutic advance, we've got less innovations, but we've got more unsafe drugs being approved onto the market. So, neoliberal reforms have not only been associated with declining rates of therapeutically valuable innovations, they've also increased safety problems. And this has been most profound in the United States, where the FDA has been massively compromised in this respect. And just very briefly say that risk management has been introduced as part of these neoliberal reforms. And what risk management means is that unsafe drugs aren't withdrawn from the market, but there's an effort to keep them on the market despite risks, okay? So the risks are managed, the risks of the drugs are managed on the market. And the consequence of this is that actually the figures in that table I showed you are actually worse. If we didn't have risk management, we'd have more drugs being withdrawn from the market. I can see I've got pressure here to finish up. So I'll just really briefly say something about risk management, which is that the ideology of risk management is that it's a way of enabling patients to keep access to drugs in the market but also manage the risks so the patients are not put at serious risk. But actually what the research onto risk management shows is that the risk management techniques, they don't prevent patients being exposed to those risks, and when those risks are serious, severe, and life-threatening, they don't necessarily prevent those things from happening. And even if they do manage to identify people at severe and life-threatening risk, by the time they do that, it's sometimes too late to stop them suffering the consequences. I'll just say, subsequent to many of these developments, we now have a lot of books coming out that I've mentioned here. Some of these people are speaking here today, and these studies are all confirming all of this social science and political science research. They're confirming all these problems, and some of them are saying it's even worse than has been reported in these social science and political science studies. So I'm now on my last slide. What the neoliberal reforms have done is provide us with a less secure evidence base about whether innovative pharmaceutical products are efficacious and safe, and they've exposed patients to more harms and risks. They've accentuated capture, for instance. They've accentuated commercial bias and regulation. Some clinical and non-clinical testing should be organized and controlled by regulatory agencies. We should have state-funded, publicly accountable regulatory agencies. We need to ban conflicts of interest. We need more regular legislative review in the UK and the EU. We need more support for drug injury litigation, so for things like legal aid and so on when people are injured by drugs, whether they're psychotropic drugs or other types of drugs. And we need to reverse the recent neoliberal anti-litigation reforms in the US, because actually things have gone backwards there. Peter's written about this in his most recent book. We need to extend whistleblower corporate integrity legislation so that people who work in industry who see biases and crimes and so on can be protected. We need a regulatory standard in which new drugs should be needed, which is a criteria involving some sort of comparative efficacy testing, not just placebo-controlled trials. And we need a phased release of new drugs related to the extent to which they offer therapeutic advance. So drugs that really genuinely offer a lot of therapeutic advance, yes, they should get onto the market quickly. But drugs that don't, what's the hurry? Let's just release them slowly and see how safe or toxic they are. And of course, I'm talking about all types of drugs here, so I'm not getting into the details of psychotropic drugs per se. If a surrogate efficacy marker is to be used, then it should be clear that the weight that is given to that in terms of benefit is much, much lower than ordinary clinical benefit. And there should be some clinical efficacy trials at least underway before the drug's approved on the market, even if a surrogate marker is being used. Okay, I don't have time to talk about things like NICE and cost effectiveness and pricing regulation. Yeah, I'll just make one sentence, which is, a lot of these innovative drugs, where we now, because of neoliberal reforms, have worse evidence about their efficacy and their safety, are massively expensive to our healthcare systems. They're hugely expensive. So I'll just leave you with that one thought.